In 1993, the conflict between NWA alumni Eazy-E and Dr. Dre was at its zenith, with barbs and dismissive remarks not only traded in songs, but also in interviews. Both men were the leaders of powerhouses, Eazy-E as the founder and CEO of Ruthless Records, and Dr. Dre as the chief producer and tastemaker of Death Row Records. However, the charts, sales, and overall impact had Death Row in the clear lead. Dre and his protege, Snoop Doggy Dogg, were the ones churning out the crossover hits and multi-platinum albums, the main engines propelling the West Coast as the dominant region of hip-hop in the early to mid-90s. Ruthless Records wasn't doing too shabbily either. At least Eazy-E had an EP certified gold at the beginning of '93, and he later released the highly effective Dre diss, Real Compton CDGs, which helped another EP go platinum by the end of the year. Plus, fellow NWA alum MC Ren had a promising initial start to his solo career, but Eazy's success couldn't be compared to that of his former partner and friend. By the end of 1993, none of his Ruthless acts were confirmed to be anywhere close to the star level of their Death Row counterparts. Among such acts was Above the Law, largely fashioned as a mini NWA. They had started off strong with 1990's Living Like Hustlers, but subsequent efforts were bogged down by distribution switchovers, legal wranglings, and the inescapable shadow of NWA. There was also the diversion of credit for a sonic concept that group leader Cold 187 had created to his mentor, Dre, who created what would become two of the greatest and most impactful hip-hop albums of all time. And finally, even from the beginning of their careers, ATL, as respected as they were among core hip-hop fans, struggled with the lack of crossover success and media recognition. According to group affiliate Cocaine, Above the Law were back to hustling when it was time to record their third album. 1993 was handing over the baton to 1994. The Republicans were yet to take control of Congress. O.J. Simpson was yet to be accused of a double homicide and lead the Los Angeles Police Department on a so-called highway chase in a Ford Bronco. A wide-sweeping crime bill was yet to be signed into law, and a certain TV movie, loosely based on a notable prison uprising with the issue of human rights at its very core, was yet to be released. Above the Law could not have been any more motivated. A memorial stands in front of the Attica Correctional Facility, which is named after the small town in upstate New York where it's located. This designated area, marked by a monument, reminds the state prison and the rest of the world of the facility's employees who lost their lives during the events of the 9th to the 13th of September 1971. The Attica prison riot became the most notorious of all prison uprisings in the United States, boiling under the context of a post-civil rights era that was giving way to the more militant Black Power movement, a growing and expanding wave of social justice clamor that included the free speech movement and the post-colonial struggles of Africa, all by the end of the 1960s. Prisoners at Attica smarted under their dehumanizing conditions. In a facility where more than half of the imprisoned population was black and mostly from the New York metro area, and virtually all of the guards were white from upstate New York, racial tensions were bound to happen. Inmates were often needlessly strip-searched and had their basic needs frequently ignored. Spanish-speaking prisoners in particular had their letters tossed out, and black prisoners were frequently racially harassed and made to do the lowest-paying jobs at the facility. There were several rebellions that rattled the New York State prison system prior to Attica. In fact, one of them, at Auburn, which was about 2 hours away, produced participants that were transferred to the Atlantic facility. Another catalyst occurred on August 21, 1971. George Jackson, an imprisoned author and activist who had co-founded the Black Guerrilla family with one of its main objectives being the establishment of dignity in incarceration, was slain by guards at San Quentin State Prison in Northern California. Whether it was Attica or San Quentin, it didn't matter. The black prisoners were all in the same gang. By the time the uprising broke out less than a month later, which was an escalation of the events that followed two inmates fighting during a recreational break, Attica was ripe for a list of demands, bundled in a manifesto and sent to the New York State Department of Corrections. For the negotiations with the state authorities, the Attica inmates were able to muster an impressive battalion of liaisons, which included renowned civil rights lawyer William Kunstler. However, New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller, a fourth-generation member of one of the wealthiest families in the United States, was not impressed, not even bothering to show up to Attica to at least empathize with the uprising. Rather, on the fifth day of the rebellion, Rockefeller authorized a force comprising state police troopers, park police, deputy sheriffs, correctional officers, and members of the National Guard to storm the Attica prison with tear gas and shotguns. The estimated casualty count of 43, with 33 of them being inmates, marked Attica as the bloodiest of prison rebellions in U.S. history. More than 2 decades later, filmmaker John Frankenheimer used the Attica prison riot as source material for Against the Wall, which premiered on HBO on March 26, 1994. The movie mainly focuses on freshman Attica corrections officer Michael Smith, played by Kyle MacLachlan, then best known for his Golden Globe-winning work on Twin Peaks, and inmate Jamal X, a composite character played by Samuel L. Jackson, who was steadily making a name for himself in Spike Lee movies and bit parts in much larger productions. When Above the Law came across the TV film, they studied it in the same way the Ghetto Boys had done with Scarface almost a decade prior, and they began to fuse the movie's aura and themes into the album they were recording. Bubbling with inspiration, the group realized that they needed a new aesthetic. The Above the Law logo, dating back to the Living Like Hustlers era, was plain sans serif font with unlocked handcuffs pinned to each end. It was updated to a livelier Gothic-style font to figuratively align with gangster rap's affection for Old English brew. And the album art needed to pop. ATL hired a young artist by the name of Kurt Nagahari to illustrate the cover art. Nagahari depicted a neighborhood with the design of a prison complex, complete with a watchtower that animates a spotlight on the tallest of the buildings within the compound, as though waiting to spot anyone trying to escape. And over the neighborhood hovers a frightening, billowy representation of Uncle Sam, the personification of the U.S. federal government. The enclosed neighborhood represents the poor living conditions that many inner-city Black Americans endure. The ghetto is the curse from Uncle Sam, the main instrument that keeps them there, in that urban Attica, ensuring that they never get out.
To you, and they are going to take your demands all the way up the line.
Uncle Sam's curse starts with a scene in Against the Wall shortly after the inmates have the surviving guards gather in the D-Yard, the open courtyard within the Attica prison where the former established their control. One of the inmates, Chaka, notably named after the Zulu warrior king Shaka Zulu and played to immense psychopathic effect by Clarence Williams III, drives home the reality that now the roles were reversed. Now the prison guards turned hostages were going to know how the prisoners had felt all this time.
You white boys gonna find out what it feel like to have the complexion for the connection. Only this time the ship be flying in the right direction.
After one of the hostages retorts that there will be no negotiating with the inmates' demands, the slow stomp of Return of the Real kicks in, followed by the gloomiest flip of Zapp's More Bounce to the Ounce that you've ever heard, buttressed by synth wail and piano note drops. A lot had changed. The mixing easily trumps that of Above the Law's previous album, approaching the standard set by Hutch's one-time mentor, Dr. Dre. Gomac, probably wary of his place as secondary DJ, was no longer with the group. In his place stepped Cocaine, Cold 187's cousin and just as musically inclined as Big Hutch. Like his older cousin, Cocaine had direct musical heritage in his family line. His father, Jerry B. Long Sr., had worked at Motown, just like Cold 187's father, Richard Hutchinson, and uncle, Willie Hutch. In Black Mafia life, Cocaine mainly rapped. But by the time Uncle Sam's Curse came along, just a few months removed from his second album, Funk Upon a Rhyme, Cocaine had morphed into a hybrid vocalist, a singer, and a rapper. That dual threat of artistry produces sterling results throughout the album, starting with Return of the Real where, amid the barbs thrown at anyone who thinks the ills of the ghetto are entirely self-inflicted, Cocaine reinforces its premise with a mournful yet threatening hook.
If you get my way, I'm gonna have to
Set Free is up next, with pianos, a guitar, violins, and female vocalists wrapped around the drum break of Clarence Reed's Living Together is Keeping Us Apart. It's a bit more upbeat, the oral representation of a day that's neither too hot nor too cold. Consequently, the beat allows the despondency of Cold 187 and KMG's lyrics to sink in, the current state of swaths of black America going through a second slavery. Set free has a double meaning. It not only refers to bettering one's socioeconomic conditions, but also escaping the prevalence, specifically in ATL's home base of Southern California, of the opposing Bloods and Crips, which are further split into subgroups, or sets, based on gang members' neighborhoods or street blocks. Cocaine was more than familiar with the gang culture, since he was affiliated with the Trey 57 gangster Crips on the west side of ATL's hometown of Pomona. It's like a vicious but necessary evil. You can't be caught slipping, but you can't glamorize it. And Set Free expertly captures the conflict young black men in that type of environment have to face, despite the need to break the mental chains. That environment bleeds into the third song, California, because it doesn't matter how sunny a slowed, hypnotic translation of the times Gigolos Get Lonely 2 is, with an extra synth wail added for more G-funk oomph. You're as likely to sight fine girls and low riders, get some good weed, and be lucky to rub shoulders with some Hollywood stars as you are to end up on the bad side of town and increase the risk of getting an early dirt nap. KMG in the first verse and Cocaine in the second verse switch from the pros of their precious California to the state's cons with the suddenness of a flash flood for optimal emotional effect. And the song itself follows suit when, upon Cold 187 entering for the third verse, the atmosphere darkens as the synth section becomes sinister to the rhythm of the hi-hatchy drum break. California Love by Tupac and Dr. Dre, released a year after Uncle Sam's Curse, is definitely the best known and most successful overt celebration of the Golden State. But you're not going to get one as close to being realistic as Above the Law's California. And just to make sure their critique is not misconstrued as condemnation, Cocaine had to add this line in.
I wish you all could be California.
West Coast for Leah, beer. Concrete Jungle is the first sample-free composition, helmed with howling synths and playful piano notes for Hutch and KMG to deliver their bars of threats at anyone who dares to cut off their sources of dough. Further aiding the smooth groove is the voice of the female radio personality that bookends the track. It's a terrific segue into Rain Before Rainbow, which further slows down the pace of the album with another Hutch original, dueling synths and a buzzing bass line tied to a drum beat with snare claps and double hi-hats. You feel Cold 187 and KMG trying to get out for once, suffocated by their dire circumstances, as well as Cocaine, who steals the show with his whispery crooning. The rain eventually gives way to the rainbow and sunlight. The steadiness and quivering of Everything Will Be Alright, achieved by cymbals, spirited piano notes, and a variance of irregularly delivered kicks with a persistent organ undercurrent, boosts lyrics that points to the hypocrisy of, to put it nicely, loose women, to justify treating them as less than worthy of Hutch and KMG's time and care.
Yeah, your name's Terry, not Holly, but you're sprung like a motherfucker when I hit that berry and let a hoe know what's popping. So now you at my house on my couch screaming out my name, my status, and my motherfucking clout, and you don't know what's going on.
It's the Mega Pimp Clinic in full force. The next song is what Eazy-E picked as the album's lead single. Peculiar behavior for a guy who never did that. But since he already understood the theme of Uncle Sam's Curse, his choice made sense. With the artwork also done by Nagahari, Black Superman sounds like the perfect preview. Two young black men from the streets of Pomona, LA County, becoming anti-heroes, not necessarily because they enjoy what they're doing, but because they feel they have to do what they're doing. The song starts with dialogue lifted from an against-the-wall scene, set in a bar, where a disgruntled Attica prison guard, lucky to not be at the correctional facility where the rebellion broke out, wishes nothing but violence retribution instead of negotiations. The guard is quickly countered by Malcolm Smith's father, Hal, who shows a bit of caution because of a curious blend of empathy for the aggrieved inmates and anxiety for the safety of his son. It's a sensible reminder that, despite the common depiction in a lot of militant rap records throughout the 90s, not all whites are heartless, inhumane devils. Then the talking box kicks in, followed by a strident beat that was becoming typical of West Coast hip-hop, a bounce concocted from the echoing slap feel of the kick and the clap feel of the snare, the boom blish. and it isn't alone. Accompanying it is a one-bar loop of the Ohio Players' Funky Worm, which by this point had been exhausted by the exploitation of its potency. But as expected, Hutch was going to come with his own twist. Reverse the one-bar sample to give it a more emotional whine than any other Funky Worm sampling job in history. In the hands of many West Coast producers, that high-pitched synth sound descended from Ohio Players band member Junior Morrison wielding an ARP Pro soloist synthesizer, easy to extract deep musical emotion from the average listener, was a convenience cheat code. In the hands of Cold 187, it became one of the main elements of inarguably the most revered G-Funk song ever. And then there's the lyrics. KMG goes first, commencing with the deep deadpan and storytelling detail he had mastered over the past 5 years. "I hit the loose juice" are the slamming opening words for a gripping description of him becoming the invincible vigilante, with a twinge of future regret making his firearm feel heavier than it should, but ultimately having his would-be victims mentally calculate their funeral costs before he sends them to the afterlife. And he has a dodo stick protruding from his mouth to smoke and keep him cool and calm throughout it all.
I'm a walking dead man is what they call me when I'm coming. Got the big S on my chest, so I'm kinda gunning.
After an interlude of an answering machine message about a raid on Cold 187's mother's house, the second verse brings in Hutch to describe his interpretation of the Black Superman concept. He's the dutiful son, entering the dope game at the age of 15 to assist his single mother, thereby making his narration a prequel for the interlude. And does he regret it? Nope, he'd rather do jail time than let his mother suffer.
Now you sucker motherfuckers don't understand, but to my mama, I'm her real black Superman.
And after his verse and the talking box hook, the electronic violin sounds, one of Cold 187's sonic trademarks and which had first showed up in Set Free, come in with vigor. The G-Funk originator always had to stand out, right to the end. The G in Me, with the Clarence Reed drum break showing up again, this time with a bit of Funkadelic's familiar Not Just Knee Deep, feels like a commemoration of unrepentant, full-blown miscreants. Apparently, these guys have a hard side and a soft side. There's more synth bass, more slap-clap drums, and more random piano notes, another mid-90s Hutch production trademark, surrounding them. And Cold 187 demonstrates his growing vocal prowess, injecting singing more frequently in his rhymes. Maybe cocaine's influence had something to do with it. That's the end of the sunnier cuts of Uncle Sam's Curse, because the title track begins the last and darkest quarter of the album. Against the Wall is given a break in favor of the 1988 film Mississippi Burning, which is loosely based on the FBI investigation of the mysterious disappearance of 3 civil rights workers in the southern state of Mississippi. 1 black, 2 white Jewish. The sample of choice is where FBI agent Rupert Anderson, played by Hollywood great Gene Hackman, recites the Ku Klux Klan hymn he comes across. Yeah, a KKK hymn. Anderson, a Mississippian himself and trying to find some humor amid the seriousness of the investigation he's participating in, offers his own critique.
These Ku Kluxers are better with lynchings than they are with lyrics.
KMG and Hutch lay out rhymes within the foreboding stump of a boom-blish beat. The bass snippet from Funkadelic's One Nation Under a Groove is transformed from joyous to bewitchingly dreary with its slurred pace, surrounded by underlying cinematic strings, prominent cymbals, a Hershey's kiss of piano notes, and the rapidly drawn violin sounds that show up at Cold 187's section of the song. Adding to the gloomy atmosphere are the opening couplets, which make up for the rather empty gangster posturing further into the song by detailing the elements that comprise Uncle Sam's Curse. The paranoia, the drug-addled streets, the dead-end, low-paying 9-to-5 jobs, the governmental apathy, and, of course, since it's LA,
And if you're walking in the mall and you're wearing blue and there's a wearing red staring at you, that's Uncle Sam's curse.
the church bell peppered one time too many is above the law at their wits' end about police harassment. Hutch and Cocaine sing a soul-stirring hook, wondering why cops can be this irritating, and that's with putting a verse about Cold 187 busted for a small amount of recreational substances next to KMG proudly espousing the no snitching rule because, above the law is kind of down with the powder. With such a contradicting message, it wouldn't be too surprising that law enforcement could be skeptical. According to a report by the Brennan Center for Justice, the national crime rate peaked in 1991 at 5,856 crimes per 100,000 people, seemingly confirming the fears of many Americans. President Bill Clinton, elected to office in 1992, might have been a Democrat, but he was going to govern with a centrist approach. And an integral aspect of that moderate stance was to prove that his party, despite general concerns, was not soft on crime. Fellow Democrat and then Senator Joe Biden of Delaware, himself destined to be president someday, drafted a bill that Clinton would sign into law on September 13, 1994. The legislation came to be known as the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, commonly known as the 1994 Crime Bill, after the name of Biden's draft. It was the largest piece of anti-crime legislation in the country's history. The 1994 Crime Bill reversed many of the prison reforms made in the post-Attica world, most notably with its 3 strikes rule. Similar to a batter in a game of baseball having 3 chances to either hit a pitched ball or lose the chance of scoring, a person convicted of 3 violent or non-violent crimes gets a life sentence. Critics were quick to point out that such a rule could lead to prison overcrowding, a situation that the Attica protesters had advocated against in their manifesto back in 1971. But the rule stayed. In 1994, 12 states in the Union would pass their own versions of the 3 strikes rule, and California was among them, due to the state's voters passing Proposition 184. In fact, California would be the state most identified with that law, no thanks to its notorious gangs, widespread application, and hip-hop culture. The prison population did swell all right, but the crime rate dropped. For all his efforts to show that he was a new Democrat, Clinton wasn't convincing the tough-on-crime Republican Party. Only weeks after the crime bill was signed into law, Democrats lost control of the Senate and the House of Representatives to the Republicans during the midterm elections. That was the first time that had happened in 4 decades, and it was an occurrence that had Newt Gingrich grinning from ear to ear. So, Above the Law could have explored bits and pieces of political and legislative affairs, including the one occurring in their own backyard, to give their Tales of the Hood a little more depth and uniqueness. And this is not just in One Time Too Many, but in any of the songs in Uncle Sam's Curse. So yeah, forget expecting Above the Law to be Public Enemy or Ice Cube or KRS-One. Just like those guys had their limitations, ATL had theirs. Onward they march to Who Ride, basically a fancy way of saying a drive-by. A down-pitched 1-bar snippet from Parliament's Color Me Funky shows up. Above the Law had always wanted to do a record with Tone Loc, with whom they had appeared on the classic 1990 anti-gang violence collaboration We're All in the Same Gang. But scheduling conflicts kept getting in the way. Thankfully, they were able to pin him down for Who Ride, a rare feat for a guy who seemed missing from a studio since his 1991 sophomore album, Cool Hand Loc. Although Tone Loc is best known for his pop rap success, his 1989 singles Wild Thin and Funky Cold Medina were the first 2 in rap history to be certified platinum, the LA native always displayed streaks of a street edge in his records. And that edge is in full baritone transported bloom here, aided greatly by a low-tempo beat figuratively perfect for a drive-by. There's the subwoofer-worthy bass, the razor-sharp cymbals, the boom-blish beat, some audio reverse effects, and of course, the synth whine.
Kick back, relax, cause I'm fat and all that. When I attack, it's like the swing of a baseball bat.
It makes you wish Tone Loc had rapped a lot more in the 90s, especially over G-Funk beats. But it wasn't going to be on another song here, because Gangsta Madness closes out the hour-long adventure. At the beginning is an against-the-wall excerpt, a speech by an inmate who looks much older than his 55 years, with 3 sons in the prison system and 3 of his 9 grandchildren slain by cops, using the commissioner's words of bending to the New York state government during negotiations in his Freedom or Death speech.
But I bit my back over this broom for so long until I didn't know no better than to keep a hold of it.
Teach on that broom, then, my brother. Teach on that broom. Come on.
If they won't let you live like men, you can show as hell die like me.
Well, all right.
Gangsta Madness is akin to Cold 187's production capstone course. with just a touch of the synths of Kool and the Gang's Summer Madness in the beginning. It's a glimmering yet somber instrumental that puts together various sounds such as acoustic guitar, finger bass, buzzing pads, a smattering of violins, and bright idiophone sprinkles. Gangsta Madness is a painful dirge, exposing the emotional toll extracted from the ones left on Earth to mourn violent losses.
But we supposed to pick up the pieces, act like it didn't happen, and wait for the next hood captain. So Uncle Sam put us through the set.
Cocaine closes out with song names of the dearly departed. ATL give a few brief shoutouts to those who helped make the album, as well as the ones who bought it. And the final Against the Wall excerpt plays out. The Attica inmates jubilating under the impression that the state had heeded their demands, while the helicopter above them gets ready to drop the first barrel of tear gas before proceeding to harm both inmate and hostage. Because in the end, in a deeply flawed system, regardless of your race and background, everybody gets screwed. Uncle Sam's Curse was released on June 12, 1994, distributed not by Giants Records, which had done so for the previous album, but by Relativity Records, which had kicked off its deal with Ruthless with Eazy-E's It's On Dr. Dre 187 Killer EP in October 1993. Coincidentally, on the night of June 12th, unbeknownst to virtually everyone, a highbrow, usually crime-free neighborhood in Los Angeles would be marked by a double homicide that mushroomed into a media circus when the suspect, football legend turned movie star and broadcaster O.J. Simpson, did not turn himself in at the LAPD headquarters. Instead, he got himself in a white Ford Bronco driven by his lifetime lackey and former USC Trojan teammate Al Collins on the 405 freeway with police at their trail. With the song One Time Too Many, Uncle Sam's Curse covers the interaction between destitute inner-city black men and hostile, presumably white, police officers. But in real life, it didn't look like the cops were as hostile to a wealthy and famous black man like OJ, even though he was suspected of not only murdering his white ex-wife, Nicole Brown Simpson, but also a young white male by the name of Ron Goldman, who was unlucky enough to go to Nicole's condo to return a pair of reading glasses. It remained to be seen if all the white adulation and acceptance that OJ had slavishly courted and maintained over the past 2.5 decades would disappear into a vicious abyss of racial denigration. But for then, OJ was receiving the equivalent of a presidential motorcade. Granted, above the law wasn't going to be charged with double murder like OJ. Well, unless it's for what they do on wax. But they had their own problems to deal with. Uncle Sam's Curse peaked at number 113 on the Billboard 200 and eventually sold about 250,000 copies. Black Superman peaked at number 24 on the Hot Rap Songs chart, a new low for ATL, and California, released as the second single early in 1995, did not chart at all. Uncle Sam's Curse revealed a disturbing trend. Each album was selling less than the previous one. So the maelstrom that became the O.J. Simpson trial can hardly be blamed for the dismal numbers. Tempting though it is, at best it may have exacerbated the commercial misfortunes of a group that was never going to be a crossover success. And of course, having a third distributor for as many albums didn't help much either. The same type of misfortune couldn't be applied to Bone Thugs and Harmony, an act newly signed to Ruthless Records that had an EP debut about 3 weeks later on the Billboard 200. Creeping on a come-up, became certified 4X Platinum by the end of 1994. By then, there was already a sense that something was wrong with Eazy-E. Bone Thugs was obviously the only commercially successful act apart from the Ruthless boss himself, and when Eazy succumbed to his final illness on March 26, 1995, coincidentally, a year to the day that Against the Wall premiered on HBO, the cuts he had started making at the beginning of the year became, in the hands of his wife and successor, Tamika Woods Wright, a bloodletting. Above the Law was spared the humiliation. Like MC Ren, who stayed, they were a legacy act that earned that respect. But there was something else. Their contract was up. Rather than stay at a place that they could no longer recognize in the aftermath of Eazy-E's demise, ATL looked elsewhere. Stepping in was Tommy Boy Records, where fellow West Coaster Coolio was enjoying the success of his breakout single, as well as the longtime abode of anthem gods Naughty by Nature, who had produced and written for ATL's fallen boss. And that was it. 7 years and a sterling catalog that comprises 3 albums and 1 EP. The Ruthless era was over. Against the Wall, the main inspiration behind Uncle Sam's Curse, was critically acclaimed upon its release. Frankenheimer received an Emmy for Outstanding Individual Achievement in Directing for a Miniseries or a Special. Jackson bagged a Golden Globe nomination as Best Actor in a Miniseries or Motion Picture for Television. Couple that nod with his role in Pulp Fiction later that year, and Jackson was on his way to becoming one of Hollywood's most prolific and highest-grossing actors of all time. For Above the Law, they had peaked with Uncle Sam's Curse. Sadly, as always, ink dedicated to the album was sparse, and it was blacked out of award schemes, both prominent and insignificant. But over the years, just like its predecessor, Black Mafia Life, Uncle Sam's Curse has gained considerable reevaluation as one of the landmark G-Funk albums, as well as one of the hip-hop classics born in the 90s. And Nagahari's precious album art made it a collectible, especially during the years it was out of print. Cold 187 once remarked that Uncle Sam's Curse is a pinnacle album in his career. Perhaps either he meant the pinnacle album in his career, or there was a misprint in the quote. Pinnacle means the highest point or culmination, unless there's more than one. While some may argue for Black Mafia Life as the greatest ATL album, thanks to its epic feel and stronger bar-for-bar trade between Cold 187 and KMG, it really is Uncle Sam's Curse, the near-perfect alignment of all elements of Above the Law's artistic maturity. Sure, Above the Law is more fatalistic than Solution Providers. There are social-political outtakes evolving little beyond familiar, the system's keeping us down territory. But weaving their ideological offerings into their well-worn hustler topics is at best admirable and commendable, giving them a more humanizing edge than ever before. Cocaine is a sterling addition, strengthening the group's already outstanding affection for melody and vocals. KMG no longer feels like a sidekick, rather he's now a fully developed rhyming partner, on equal footing with Big Hutch, and even outshining him occasionally. Cold 187's G-Funk is conventionalized yet distinctive, incorporating the prevailing production elements of a Dre-dominated world, while being unique with his own advancing personal touch as the musical style's originator. There's also the graduation from G-Funk's P-Funk roots, Hutch now being less reliant on simply mixing and layering Parliament Funkadelic samples and becoming more of a composer and arranger. And finally, of course, Uncle Sam's Curse has Black Superman, ATL's signature song. Black Superman has exemplified Uncle Sam's Curse's expanding reverence among hip-hop fans, as well as its growing presence in the consciousness of US pop culture. In the multi-award-winning 2016 miniseries The People v. O.J. Simpson, the first entry in the American Crime Story Anthology series, O.J., played by Cuba Gooding Jr., is now on trial. He's armed with a dream team of high-powered attorneys led by Johnny Cochran, best known for his involvement in civil rights cases and played by Courtney B. Vance. Noting Cochran's laudable track record and charisma, the prosecution team needed a direct counter, and it would help if the lawyer were black. And so the final scene of episode 4, to the tune of Black Superman, has a slightly slowed strut of OJ and his dream team into the courtroom, only for the camera to not focus on Cochran, the leader of the defense, but rather hand over to Christopher Darden, appointed the leader of the prosecution and played by Sterling K. Brown. It's a marvelous dual TV interpretation of Black Superman's anti-hero premise. The successful black attorney framing his case for his equally successful black client as fighting against a racially oppressive system versus the black attorney working within the system to expose the defendant as anything but innocent and proudly black. It's Attica on a much larger scale. That's Uncle Sam's Curse. Thanks for watching. For those new here, welcome to Rap Perspective. For the Rappleheads, I greatly appreciate your support. Don't forget to like, comment on, and share this video, and make sure you subscribe to the channel. And I encourage everyone to watch, like, comment on, and share other videos on here. See you in the next video.